Thank you very much, and let me thank Director Singh for the invitation to Southern California University. Thank you very much. The Wrigley Center for Environmental Studies and the Center for the Political Future. This conference on climate change is important, and I'm glad that I have a couple of comments, not only to thank you for attending, but to welcome you. You know, right now you see the administration and others in Congress attempt to walk this tightrope. The reality of climate change and the climate crisis increases, and so the focus needs to be on transition, the focus needs to be on sustainability, and the focus needs to be on equity. But we see that we're confronting some pushback, and that pushback is intense. It is about denial to some extent, but not to the degree that it was. It is about avoidance, not dealing with the issue at all, and somehow it'll magically go away. And the other one is delay. And what you see, its prominence in public policy, to delay decisions. And the latest being this tightrope, that we need energy independence, that we need energy security, and that we must do all we can to deregulate and drill and extract from wherever we can on public lands and private lands as a means to reach energy independence and deal with the cost of fuel and deal with the terror in Ukraine by Russia. Those become the mantras now of the opposition, to delay. You know, and the fact remains that science and fact-based studies and information, we don't need any more of those. There are volumes upon volumes that talk about the consequences, the projections, and all rooted in science and fact. So, you know, that's why you don't hear too much debate about climate change and its reality, because it's already a proven fact. What science and fact-based studies are doing now is detailing the consequences of not doing anything about climate, the disasters, the hardships on lives, regions, homes, economies around the globe and in our communities. So where do we go from here? At this very critical juncture where the transition away from fossil fuel dependency needs to happen. A measured, pragmatic, and accelerated process of transition to get us onto clean and just energy and away from the corrupting, not only environmentally, but politically, I might add, influence of fossil fuel and that industry. So where are we now? I think the challenge, building energy for change and dealing with this climate crisis, as this theme is, I think the concentration now is not an academic exercise or a research project. This is about communicating and motivating people, the public, and in our instance, here in the United States of America. To motivate and to have a narrative that communicates to people and that motivates them to begin to pressure their elected officials to align the climate policy with the reality of the climate crisis. Not to delay, not to stall, not to avoid, but to go forward. And I think that's the juncture that we're in. So this conference is opportune to be able to talk about where we're going, but also understand that the underpinning to what happens in the next 6 months to a year will be, the underpinning will be how we communicate and how we motivate the American people. That's going to be key. And your efforts in that end, your discussions and your conversations today will lead us in that direction. The commitment has to be what the commitment has always been. That climate change is real, that the transition has to happen, and that transition has to be just and equitable. That's the commitment I have. I'm assuming And I know that that's the commitment many of you have. Now is taking that commitment and making our neighbors understand that commitment, and with that understanding, motivate them to help us. Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure, and have a good conference.
From that member of Congress and my first question, because I think it raises a very intriguing possibility that's becoming very real right now. So we're going to spend some time on politics as well as energy. And let me introduce the panel. One of the folks isn't here yet, but when he comes in, he'll have a seat down at the end, and they'll put him in. Ted Bardacke, I'll just go straight down. Ted Bardacke is the CEO of Clean Power Alliance, a locally operated electricity provider for 32 communities and approximately 1 million customers across Los Angeles and Ventura counties. Before that, he was Director of Infrastructure for the City of Los Angeles and Deputy Director of Mayor Garcetti's Sustainability Office. Ara Vasquez is the Chair of the Climate Action Committee with the Los Angeles chapter of the Sierra Club. She is a former commissioner of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Tough job that I wouldn't want. She did great. Through her firm, Vasquez Solutions, she successfully pushed for a law that requires utilities to produce 50% of their electricity from clean energy sources by 2030 and to reduce greenhouse gas levels to 40% below 1990 levels. Jason Rondeau is the Director of Resource Planning, Development, and Programs at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, where he oversees, and I'll tell you, this list is amazing. Sounds like you oversee everything. The engineering of stations, integrated resource planning, utility scale renewable and energy storage procurement, as well as distributed energy resource planning and implementation. That's a pretty big brief. He previously led the LA 100 study, which identified the major investments required to reliably and cost-effectively transition the Department of Water and Power to 100% renewable energy. Our final panelist, who I think will be here in a few minutes, is Ivan Penn, energy correspondent for the New York Times, who covers alternative energy. Before coming to the Times in 2018, he covered utility and energy issues for nearly 8 years at the Tampa Bay Times and then the Los Angeles Times. I'm going to start with a broader question that was raised in that video from Representative Grijalva. I never say it right. I apologize. Grijalva? Oh, yes, I got it. Okay. Who wanted to be with us today but had a conflict. And it may be an unpopular question. Given what's happened in Ukraine and with the price of gasoline, should we or will we have to modify climate goals for the short term? And will public opinion demand that we do so in order to produce more oil and gas, not only for the US, but for our European allies as they seek to replace Russian oil and gas? Who wants to start off with that? Anyone? I mean, I think this is a very real possibility. You're going to see a lot of pressure to do this. I think the mic, Ivan, okay. Welcome.
Hey, Ivan.
Question is, are we going to be under pressure now? Are we going to be under pressure, given what's happened in Ukraine, given gas prices? Are we going to be under pressure to modify climate change goals for a while so we drill more, produce more natural gas, both for our own needs and to free Europe from being a hostage of Russian oil and gas? Who wants to start?
I'll start. So one of the terrible things about the energy business, but in this case, maybe one of the great things about the energy business, is it's very capital intensive and it moves very slowly. Utilities take a long time to change. The energy business takes a long time to change. And a lot of what has been put in motion over the past several years in terms of goals, and then the capital deployment that is needed to reach those goals, can't be reversed. You can see stuff on the margins, but the stuff on the margins doesn't impact. You saw the release of millions of gallons from the strategic petroleum reserve, right? That's a real short-term thing. It didn't make a dent in what happened with prices. To build LNG plants to take natural gas to Europe, from the East Coast or from the Gulf Coast, is, those are 5 years and billions of dollars. So I think what we see is a blip. Now the blip can have some long-term impacts if what it does is it stalls any congressional action to speed us up. But I don't think the current moment is going to slow us down.
So what are the Europeans supposed to do your Germans have said they're going to stop buying Russian oil and they want to get off Russian gas. What are they supposed to do if we can't make up the difference? Anybody? I mean, look, so let's say you're Joe Biden. You're sitting there in the White House. The Republicans are saying the big problem with gas prices is you're anti-oil and gas. The big problem with Europe's situation is that we don't have the resources to share with them. And so Ukraine's going to be subject, or Western Europe's going to be subject, and our NATO allies are going to be subject to blackmail for a long time. How do you deal with that?
I want to return to the concept of energy democracy or energy independence, because now we're closer to energy independence more than ever. Specifically here in Los Angeles, and when you look at oil prices and cars, in California, there's a huge movement around bringing more EV infrastructure and also electrical vehicles and making them accessible to everyone. But how are we going to power them? How are we going to make sure that also all the other people that cannot afford an electric vehicle can afford it, so that we can all participate? So I think it's important to remember that we have been having the solutions and we have been asking for energy independence for a really long time, especially climate justice communities that are most burdened by pollution and by climate change. We have been asking to give them also solar and batteries and make microgrids in their communities that can make them independent. And this is not just good for them, it's also good for the private sector. It brings jobs, and it's also it's very labor intensive. And these are not jobs that we can outsource to China. This is not somebody else that can do it in the East Coast. We have to do them locally. So as we look at energy independence and also energy democracy, we can revitalize our economy and put people back to work and help businesses thrive, and also stop our reliance on foreign, oil and gas.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just quickly add, really similar to the comments on EVs. I think we all know that what's happened with gas prices, and we're very fortunate, many of us, to have choices to get an electric vehicle. But what we realize now is that many folks don't have that choice because, one, they can't afford an electric vehicle, or two, there's no ability to get the charging infrastructure to where they would need to charge it, whether it's multifamily or whether it's in disadvantaged communities. So one thing that this is an opportunity for us is to reaffirm that to do a successful decarbonization effort, it needs to be done equitably. And it's not being done equitably right now, and we're not getting enough charging infrastructure into communities that need it. And we're not doing enough, and when I say we, I mean the broader we, to incentivize and to make electric vehicles affordable. I think the other thing that I'll say to that is we at a local level have invested a lot of time in doing very rigorous planning to figure out not just setting a goal to get to 100% renewable energy, but figuring out all the major investments that we need to make. And that takes time, that takes a lot of analysis, and we partnered with the federal government to bring in top scientists to help us do that. What that did is it showed us that a lot of the near-term things that we need to do are pretty straightforward, and they're not that surprising. And we know that in the less than the next 10 years, we can go from a little over 50% carbon free to actually 97% carbon free. So we know in a very short term, we can dramatically reduce our natural gas reliance. And what that does is it not only helps us locally, but it sets an example for the rest of the state and the rest of the country. And just in the last couple of months, We've had 2 Eastern European countries send delegates to Los Angeles to meet with us to understand what our planning process was. So, to the degree that that helps in the short run, we don't know. But what we do know is that the more action that we take now and the more that we have our sights set on a very equitable transition, we can actually play a pretty significant leadership, not just locally, but potentially internationally as well.
Ivan, forgive me for being political, but that's what I do. And 5 or 6 years, short term, I think amazing things can be done. In 5 or 6 months, we're going to have a midterm election. And right now, there are enormous pressures on the White House, on the president, on Democrats in Congress. The Republicans are arguing that the high gas prices are a function of hostility to oil and gas. The Europeans are saying, as I said earlier, they need oil and gas, and the Republicans are pushing that argument. How do you navigate your way through this without doing some real damage to these efforts longer term, the 5 or 6 year efforts to achieve real progress on climate?
So,
It should be on.
okay. So before I started covering energy, I covered government and politics.
Right. I know that. That's why I asked.
And a good part of that was covering the Maryland General Assembly. And there was a senator there named Barbara Hoffman. And she said, Ivan, this is government and politics. And if you don't like the politics, get out the government. Now, the problem with that, related to your question, is the tensions and the challenges that the government leaders have from all of the different quarters. You have the environmental community that's pushing for the clean energy piece. You have climate change that's pulling everyone in the direction of, we've got to deal with the worsening of natural disasters. You have the unions that are players in this who say, well, look, you want to go from a natural gas plant that employs 60, 100 people. You want to eliminate, in California's case, the last nuclear plant. Nuclear plants employ hundreds of people, to a solar farm that after it's built is a guy with a squeegee. So you've got the union pressures, you've got the decision that was made in regard to natural gas that this is going to be the bridge fuel. So that decision, just like all of the other decisions that we're grappling with, the fact that we have combustion engines and we're looking at electric vehicles is not a new question. It's a 100-year-old question. Folks just need to go down to the Peterson Museum on Wilshire and see the electric vehicle and home electric vehicle charger that existed 100 years ago. We made the decision that gasoline was going to be the fuel that powered our transportation. We made the decision in weaning off of coal that natural gas would be our fuel to bridge us to a clean energy future. So you've got the natural gas players who are saying, well, this is what you did for us. So now you're trying to take that away in the name of clean energy. You have the unions arguing, you have the environmental, you have all of these different pressures pulling on a president, on a Congress, on state legislatures, on governors, and people are having difficulty doing what it is that they believe may or may not be right and true.
See this, yeah. So I'm, let's say that there's a massacre in the election in November for let's say the pro-environmental groups in Washington. Let's just posit that might happen, right? I think we will turn for progress back to local efforts. And I'll just talk about our organization as an example. We're a locally operated, locally governed nonprofit electricity provider. We have 1 million customers, 32 communities across Los Angeles and Ventura counties. Very diverse groups diverse political views on the board of directors, who are all local government officials, all local city council people, who are very, very attentive to what their communities want. Republicans, Democrats, decline to state, aggressive decline to state. But they all are unified in understanding that the impacts of climate change have hurt their communities locally. And it's no different than, I think, Miami, where they've outlawed the use of word climate change while they're spending tens of billions of dollars to shore up Miami. Even though they won't say the word, they will take action. So I think, and what has happened in our organization is these local leaders have said, we're going to supply our communities with 100% renewable energy. So in 4 years, we've become the largest supplier of 100% renewable energy in the country, based on decisions by local city council people. And that is powerful. It gives me hope. And it happened right through the Trump presidency, that happened. And maybe I'm living in a California bubble. Maybe I'm living in a Los Angeles, Ventura County bubble. But I do think that people across the country on this issue are demanding action, and that will bubble up from the local level if the federal government sort of gets out of the business.
So what do you make of the recent polling in the state that shows that statewide voters think climate is only the 6th most important issue that we have to decide? I mean, it's an existential issue, I think most of us here believe. It involves the future of the planet. But right now, people seem much more focused on other issues. How do you bring them around to focus on that?
I don't think that is new. I think it's Earth Day. Happy Earth Day, everyone. And we're still struggling to make environment, climate justice issues relevant, because for so many people, first can't pay their rent or having a job or healthcare. I mean, how many people we still are uninsured? And so it's hard. We just went through something so incredible together, the pandemic. We quarantined together. We fought up about wearing masks or not wearing them. And we're still kind of in the mix of coming out of that period in history that we didn't really have precedent. And so making, it's a very different conversation for people that have lost their homes through wildfires, than for people that maybe that don't see climate issues or environmental issues so tangible to them. So, for example, right now, I read in the paper very recently that for mayors, we're in a mayoral election this year here in Los Angeles, and they don't even have their environmental agenda in their websites. So I think we're really, really back to the beginning again, and where we have to scream and kick and and demand and show up and do all these die-ins and all these things that a lot of us did in the 90s and the 2000s to make this issue relevant. The difference is now that there is a different consciousness, that we know that we're headed there, that this might not be in the forefront, but we know that this is important and this is making us lose money, lose lives, that is hindering us from being more innovative and more connected. And this is something that we have to bring back to the forefront. And I hope that this Earth Day, every day should be Earth Day, and we can really bring these issues back to the forefront of everyone's mind.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would add to, I think, both of those concepts. I think one thing that we have to be a little bit careful of, it is absolutely true what Ted said about we will continue the efforts despite what may happen at the federal level. And when Ted says that, he means it because he lived that and he helped champion that. But I do want to just emphasize that what happens at the federal level does still matter so much to us, even in cities that are forward thinking, that are looking to aggressively pursue climate solutions and climate goals. And part of that is because when billions of dollars funnel into technologies, those mature more rapidly. Those bring down costs for local levels. And one concept that I think is not in folks' consciousness is that we're talking about funding an infrastructure transformation. And the way that we're going to fund it, business as usual, short of a significant amount of state and federal dollars. The way that we're going to fund that is with electricity rates. And that is extraordinarily regressive. And that's not to say that's not the way to do it, but under business as usual, unless we inform policymakers that to fund billions of dollars of infrastructure transformation with electricity rates means the poorest folks in the city, the poorest folks in the states will have an undue burden on them to fund that. And so while it is, I do think it's absolutely true because we've seen it, that things will continue, the movement will continue. What happens at the federal level makes a huge difference in making sure that this can be done affordably and that technologies can rapidly mature, because there are a lot of emerging technologies that we will need in order to do this successfully. So I just wanted to add on to that. And I think the last thing that I'll say is maybe, and I'm getting out of my lane, so I'm going to keep this really, really short and sweet. Maybe part of the lack of this being in the forefront of people's consciousness is when we set goals for 100% renewable energy and 100% carbon free, maybe that makes folks feel like the job's done, but the job's just starting. That is the first piece of what needs to happen. There's a lot of things, not just on the implementation side, but on the policy side, to bring down the barriers and to mitigate risk. So maybe, and I'm just speculating again, this is not my lane, so take it with a grain of salt, but maybe that contributes to the folks not feeling like this is at the forefront, because maybe there's a feeling that the job is done, or we're on our way, and that's not the reality at all.
I'm talking a minute about the federal government and then the local governments. But Ivan, I'm going to let you weigh in on this.
As I was listening to everyone, I thought about, and in your question, it was on the celebration of the 1,000,000 solar roofs. Former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, he said, listen, the problem is, and you can give it the weight that you feel it deserves, but he said the problem is the messaging. When you talk about climate change, it's hard for people to get a concrete vision of something. But in his words, he said, but if you say pollution, everybody gets pollution. So the challenge ends up becoming, how do you deliver messaging that raises those poll numbers to something more significant than fifth, sixth place? Because when you look at a variety, again, of the political issues, while the general public may hate some of the just talking points, those are the things that ends up driving the direction of the policy and the overall discourse. So if you have one group of people breaking down the all of the scientific elements of what is driving us to have worsening wildfires and a winter storm that grips the entire state of Texas, or Hurricane Ida shutting down all the electricity in New Orleans, and giving us the chapter and verse of the science, people are going to tune out. It's a hard thing to get the general public on board with a message that is complex. So on the other side of it, you have the utility companies that say, well, renewable energy, distributed generation in particular, hurts the poor and the low income. Now, whether that's true or not is another subject of debate, but the messaging has this enormous impact on the discourse and policy.
Well, that's why I think you have to put this in a political context, and you can't just say, here's what we would like to do. You have to talk about how we get it done. And I think states and localities can do it, private companies can do it. And there may be some hope, according to White House climate advisor Gina McCarthy today, that Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who may be the most powerful senator from West Virginia ever, we always thought Senator Bob Byrd was, that he's the critical 50th vote in the Senate. He may be on board with the climate provisions of the Build Back Better bill. And that would constitute the largest investment in clean energy by the federal government ever, by any government ever. How much difference would that make?
from my perspective, it would make a lot of difference, tremendous amount of difference. When I said we're going to do this even with or without the federal government, I didn't mean that the federal government couldn't have a big impact. And what some provisions of that bill would do from my perspective of trying to move quickly is are two things. One is it would bring massive investment in R&D to try to bring to commercialization a whole new set of technologies for the things that are most acute on the grid right now, which is how do we store energy? We have really right now kind of two technologies. One that's decades and decades old, where we pump storage and pump water up and down, and then we have a relatively newer one, lithium-ion batteries. But to have the whole electricity grid transformation sort of bound up in one or two or maybe three green hydrogen technologies it's not enough. So that would be one area where a big improvement. And then the other thing would be, to Jason's point about cost. So there are provisions in there that would lower the cost of us as an electricity provider, lower the cost of procurement, and lowering the cost of procurement lowers rates. I mean, there's a direct correlation between how much we have to spend to get energy and how much we charge for energy. And if we can do anything through tax credits, through incentives, to lower the cost for large-scale providers of renewable and low-carbon energy, that's going to have a direct impact on rates and not eliminate the regressiveness of electricity rates, but certainly mitigate some of it.
Anyone else want to come in on this? You should be
I
on.
want to say is no Green New Deal, but the Build Back Better is definitely is going to be an incredible support. Also because it's not just certainly California working on these goals and prizing ourselves to be such great environmental leaders, but this is going to force every state in the United States to also look at how they can modernize their grid, how they can bring more renewable energy, more electrical vehicle infrastructure. Again, I want to return to the conversation of jobs. It's super important that we have a pathway to good jobs for those people that are affected by climate change. And imagine what's going to happen if the Build Back Better passes in the Midwest, how this is going to transform and how this is going to bring them up to speed to a lot of other states that are ahead of the game when it comes to renewable energy. We are in the phase of decarbonizing the grid, electrifying everything, finding ways to have, new buildings be full electric and not have any fossil fuel infrastructure. But I want to remind everyone that the issue of munching that we have today is because we still have a huge influence of the fossil fuel industry in our political system. They still put people in place. They still support certain candidates to get to office. And this is why we have sometimes these battlefields of policymakers that can't get things done, because we have a huge industry behind the other side of things, pushing for something that is not the best for us and for the environment.
Well, and there were two things that were raised. I think Jason mentioned rates, and Ted mentioned that what we build, these are drivers in terms of cost. So if you take those two elements together, one of the major challenges that we have, no matter how much money gets put in a bill, is what are we incentivizing the utility companies, the energy industry to actually do? Right now, we incentivize them to build, and that's where they make their money. And in fact, a lot of the utilities now, they really like to yell at me about saying that they make money, particularly in California, off of the sale of electrons. Though I will note that without us using kilowatts, then they don't have any revenue. So with that, but I'll leave that one alone. They describe themselves now as construction companies. And so if we are just going to keep building, then the question is, how much is that going to ultimately cost, and how much can the ratepayers bear? Because if we're still going to be relying on natural gas. I mean, no matter how much the effort is to wean ourselves for the short term, we're dealing with natural gas. And if those prices continue to fluctuate or particularly go up, and given the dynamics that we're dealing with Ukraine and the needs of Europe, that's going to be a factor. So we've got that pressure on rates, and we have the building pressure on rates. So unless, along with all of the money, there is a change in the incentive for the utilities and the energy companies to do something different, we're going to have some challenges.
And that brings me in a way, I was going to go to localities, but I want to go to this first. You've all mentioned electric vehicles in one way or another. And I have kind of three questions about them. First of all, do we think consumers are really ready to junk their internal combustion engines? Number two, how do we deal with the equity issue that there are a lot of people who can't afford to buy an electric car? And number three, if you don't actually make the electrical grid renewable and you have electric vehicles and they're in effect being powered by coal or oil and gas, have you achieved anything? I'm sorry, I think it's
I love this question because I'll use my own experiences as an example. Are consumers excited? So if you've never driven an electric vehicle, you should go drive one. It's really fun because you step on the accelerator. You don't step on the gas anymore. You step on the accelerator. And it's this, 100% torque like right away. But on February 1st, it cost me $12 to fill up my electric vehicle. On March 1st, it cost me $12 to fill up my electric vehicle. On April 1st, it cost me $12 to fill up my electric vehicle. The affordability on the operations and the fueling, I think, can really sort of get a lot more people into accepting, at least going to try the electric vehicle. So that's one. Second, people can't afford the vehicle in the first place. So we now have a system in place of incentives, both in DWP territory as well as our territory, of providing rebates for used vehicles. And one of the things that I think is a real sort of local stimulus for market is, to the extent that we could start stimulating a market for used electric vehicles, we lower the price point, but we also sort of start getting more demand out there in the economy. And the last thing is, when I paid that $12 to fill up my electric vehicle, I fueled it with 100% renewable energy. Provided by Clean Power Alliance. So I think it's a myth that that there's this dirty grid out there that somehow the EVs aren't pulling their weight in terms of climate reduction.
But if you live in Illinois and you have an electric vehicle and you charge it, you're probably going to be charging it from a coal-fired station
For the foreseeable
future, for a while.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people understand electric vehicles and they're really important. And especially right now, I'm sure we all know somebody who owns an extraordinarily expensive gas vehicle that's complaining about gas prices, and they have a choice, and that's the bottom line. But you also see people with electric vehicles saying, oh, if you're complaining about gas prices, go buy an electric vehicle. It's absolutely not that simple. People cannot, not especially in Los Angeles and across this state, a lot of people cannot afford electric vehicles, and even if they can, they don't have access to charging. And so utilities have to address that. We're trying to address that. We have used EV rebates. We also have incentives for chargers, but we also have an increased incentive for chargers in disadvantaged communities, because we know that, you often hear chicken or egg. Do we install the charging now? This is not a chicken or egg problem. We have to have electric vehicles, not just to decarbonize the transportation sector, but it is what makes the transition of a clean electric grid affordable. I'll say that a different way. if we don't see electrification the way that we need it to happen, both on the building side and then on the transportation side, we cannot transform our electric grid affordably. So we need to see that fuel switching from gasoline vehicles and gas stovetops and all of that to electrification in order to make this affordable. Utilities will play a really, really significant role in that. And I think our success in this relies on us doing this equitably. We're not going to get broad support for this if the richest in the state and the richest in the city are the only ones who can afford to do this. And so this comes back to equity, and it comes back to our success relies on doing this equitably, because what we're trying to do is set an example, and we're not setting a good example. We're setting a cautionary tale if we do this in a way that's not equitable. I think I'll just kind of complete this thought to say the importance is not just on the carbon reduction side. The vast majority of the local air quality impacts will be mitigated or will be reduced with the electrification of especially the light duty vehicles. It is so important, not just for carbon reductions, but for local air quality as well.
Go ahead, either of you. We
Well-
can take turns here. It's fine.
Well, so a couple of things. I mean, now we did some reporting on what were some of the motivating factors of people who were buying electric vehicles, particularly in the zip codes in the state with the highest number of electric vehicles. Interestingly enough, while Los Angeles has, on a whole, a lot of EVs, the individual zip codes did not make the top 20. They were in the Bay Area and they were in the San Diego area. So we went to San Diego and we talked to the folks who were buying EVs. Yes, there are those who are environmentally conscious, many of them early adopters, but many of them said, I bought a Tesla because it's cool and it's fast. The messaging, again, became the driver.
And that's
no pun
fine, by the
intended.
way. If that's how they get to the electric vehicle, that's fine.
Sure, but the question becomes about the messaging. I mean, and then also the affordability, because when we were making the switch from incandescent bulbs to LEDs to compact fluorescents and then LEDs, there were a lot of people who went to the hardware store and they said, well, the incandescent bulb is $1, and the compact fluorescent is $5, and the LED is 10 or 12. They're thinking about, that's my milk and that's my bread. So when you start looking at the price of EVs, which was another component of what we were reporting on, they were still too high for a lot of people.
I'm so glad that you're asking this question, because at the beginning of the pandemic, I got rid of my car. I work from home, and we were not supposed to be out there exploring in the world. So, I just got rid of my car. So I have been without owning a car now. We've been in this pandemic 2 years. So, as I see that kind of the pandemic is a thing of the past, I started looking into, what's the kind of car that I want to get? And of course, it's gonna have to be an energy efficient, vehicle. But here is the kicker. I'm a renter. Over 70% of the people in Los Angeles at least are renters. So how are we gonna charge our cars? And I live in a home right now, and the landlord can be cool about me putting a charging station there, great. But what if I move? And if in the new building they don't have a charging station, who do I call? How do I charge my car? So this is number one for maybe the younger generation that can afford to buy an electrical or a hybrid electric vehicle. The second part is that a lot of folks out there that are low income, this is not in their radar. They don't think it's cool. They don't even know. It's a very intangible thing, and I applaud the fact that we have rebates for used vehicles, because that's going to help more people penetrate the EV market. But I don't know if it's going to be enough. I think we're going to have to be very aggressive if we are serious about getting everyone an EV car. And I mean, we see in California that after 2035, we're not going to be selling any more gas power cars. So I agree with Jason that we need to figure out how we're going to make infrastructure accessible for everyone. And right now is again, it's really hard. And the same is happening with solar. Like if you're a renter and, you know, at DWP, we have shared solar, you know, we have solar for renters programs now, but how do I fold my solar panel and bring it with me to my next, you know, location? Is that going to happen one day? Are we going to have that type of technology? But, you know, in this conversation about EV, the other piece is, what about people that have to travel long distances? There's a lot of people that commute to Los Angeles because they can't afford to live in LA. So housing affordability becomes a thing when it comes to climate change, you know, and the transit-oriented communities and those things. But, you know, think about rural areas. And as a nature lover, I go explore, backpacking, you know, I do all those crazy things out there in nature. And how do I get to a mountain in my electric vehicle and hope for the best to return me home? So, you know, so there's a lot of nuances that we still have to figure out. And I agree that it's not a chicken and an egg. We just have to tackle all of it kind of together.
Let me just say one quick story about the chicken and egg thing, because the point about getting the chargers out there is really, really, really important. And there's an incredible demand out there. On April 5th, we put out $23 million in EV charger incentive rebates, released a new program, $23 million. That money was reserved in 3 hours. 3 hours, $23 million got sucked up by people who want to install EV chargers. These are not home EV chargers. These are for workplace, for renters, for multifamily buildings, shopping centers. We could spend millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars, and we're going to have to make the EV transition.
My only EV story is I was taking an Uber to USC one day just before the pandemic, and the Uber driver, believe it or not, and it wasn't an Uber Black, it was a regular Uber. He had a Tesla, and he was paying for the Tesla by driving for Uber. And we're coming down the freeway, the what I used to call the Santa Monica freeway, because I lived in Los Angeles a long time ago. And he suddenly takes his hands off the steering wheel and says, "Watch, the car can drive itself." It was the most terrifying minute and a half I've ever had. I want to get to audience questions, but I want to throw out one quick last question and just go down. And it's about a big challenge and about something that would require really aggressive action. LA is committed to be carbon-free by 2035. Do you think that's possible, especially when all the focus now is on homelessness and crime? And as you pointed out, the mayoral platforms don't even yet have a climate section. So do you think it's possible to get there by 2035, politically possible?
I should probably address this question.
I was going to.
Yeah. So it's recognizing it's a lightning round. I'll do my best to answer a really long question with a short answer. We did a study. We spent 4 years. We brought in the National Renewable Energy Lab, the top scientists in the world, to figure out how to do that, to answer that question. And we found out that it is technically possible. It is technically achievable to do it not just by 2045, as the state has said. It is possible to do it by 2035. That is not the end of the story. The end of the story is that there still is work to be done on the infrastructure side, on the technology side, on the equity side, and on the policy side. Because if we don't do this in a way that's reliable, that's equitable, that's affordable, and in a way that maintains and creates well-paying jobs, LA will not lead the state and will not lead the country. We will be a cautionary tale. So it is possible to do this, but we need more action to make sure that we can build the infrastructure quickly. And that's, we spent a lot of time at the state talking to legislators saying we need to figure out how to build transmission faster. We need to figure out how to get more federal dollars and more state dollars to be able to buy down the cost to make sure that this is equitable. And the last thing that I'll say is the study said, you can do this equitably, but it really needs to have intentionally designed policies and programs. And so what we did in response to that is we kicked off what's called the LA 100 equity strategies. And it's a recognition that we don't know what equity means to our community, and that we have the humility to bring in community-based organizations to help identify what that means to them. How do they have access to programs, to policies, to EVs, to charging, and all of that? And it's something that, I'll wrap it up by saying, yes, there's a lot of work to do to bring down some of those risks and those barriers that in some cases are within our control, within the utilities' control. In other cases, it's up to policymakers and others to bring down those barriers.
Having worked for the current mayor in sustainability, I think LA has been blessed with having a mayor who was a big environmental champion before he became mayor and has remained true to that. It hasn't been a fad for him. I'm not sure we're going to have the same kind of leadership in the mayor's office, regardless of who wins. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not sure. And so what I would say is one of the big things to pay attention to in the upcoming election is the city council. The city council was able to follow the mayor here. But if you're looking for who to vote for, vote for city council people who are going to lead, because we may not have that same kind of leadership in the mayor's office.
Okay, we're really into politics now, so I think it's time that we go to some Q&A. First, let's do a Zoom question, and then we'll do the audience. Do you have a mic, Ben?
Thank you. A question from Diane Wallace on Zoom. Related to electric vehicles, how can individual people with electric vehicles and solar and storage drive sustainability when the CPUC makes decisions that eliminate the benefits of installing solar storage in electric vehicles?
You've
That
covered
I
this,
would have
Ivan.
I'm happy to touch on that from LA's perspective. I will say that we're not subject to the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission. So when it comes to creating programs and when it comes to creating opportunities for the public to participate, we have set up a wide array of community solar programs, EV rebates, that have tried to touch all of the different segments across the city. But we have a lot of work to do. And I talked about bringing in our equity strategies efforts to identify how to actually reach the communities, how to overcome some of the barriers that we don't understand. So we don't have that capability, and we have to know that we don't have that capability. And then I think I'll just wrap it up to say, we're governed by our city council and our appointed board. Folks in Los Angeles have the ability, have the access, and have the ability to shape what our future looks like. And that's very different from the rest of California.
Unless anybody else wants to comment on that, let's go to questions from the audience. Anyone have a question? Yes.
Hi, Stephen Hubbard, graduate of the Sol Price School. This is for Ivan. When you look at the rotary rigs that are in operation, the speed up this time around after the drop off versus 2016 is only about half as fast. And so I know it's not lost on the oil industry that if they're slow to build production back up, the prices will go up. And I'm sure there's someone has lots of spreadsheets on the cost benefit ratio of a delayed action. And so the question is, do you know whether this is sort of a strategy or is just a result of the pandemic and it's much harder this time versus the previous time? Thank you.
Ivan, I think you got to do this.
So your question goes to a technical side that I'm half of a coin. My colleague Cliff Krause is the oil, natural gas, and coal fuel side of that coin, and I'm the grid and renewables. That said, I mean, you have a lot of complexities in all of these pieces, where you have a reliance on fossil fuels, both on the side of on the electricity side, and then obviously transportation is driven by it. So when you calculate the fact that the administration has said to the oil and gas industry, we want you to produce more, there's a realization that there is a need. That was before we even really started to engage with the issues of Ukraine. Ramping back up is always more expensive. But how do you meet all of the dynamics that we're dealing with? Because in as much as a lot of the things that we've already talked about in terms of the energy transition, there's a big reality about the time element. And some of that is starting to come to the fore. The realization that some of the goals and the targets that were set are going to be hard to reach. Take, for instance, on the renewable side, we have an emphasis on offshore wind when we don't have a boat. So how are we going to put all these turbines in the water? So there's a challenge. You have the utilities fighting against rooftop solar. So where is all of this energy to meet have half the vehicles by 2030 electric? How are we going to get there when the distribution system isn't equipped for the kind of transition that we're talking about? So in short, you're having to ramp up, and those costs, starting anything again, getting things back up is going to cost something. But part of the reason why that's happening is there's a realization that there are some challenges with the time frame.
Ibrahim, why don't you come up here because she has a question, and then we'll come back to you.
Hello, I'm Annika. Thank you guys so much for coming today. I just have a question about the power grid and it handling the transition to more electric vehicles. In my class the other day, we were talking about how, like, if everyone were to transition to electric vehicles, the power grid couldn't handle that. So what's kind of happening on that side of things? What level is it at right now? How many people can really be having electric vehicles, and going forward, what's being done so that transition can be successful?
I'd like to answer that question if I can. That is an extraordinarily important question because it's not just about, again, decarbonizing the power grid. The power grid will enable the successful or the unsuccessful transition to electric vehicles. And so we need to make sure our distribution grid can power electric vehicles when folks are trying to charge. So today, over the last maybe 20 years, we have built about 2 stations that essentially provide power to homes and businesses and that sort of thing. And if you drive across Los Angeles, you might see a building that's kind of like an Art Deco style building. And it's not because our architects like that style, it's because they were built back when that was the architecture. And so when you look at the last 20 years, I think we've built 2 of those stations. We have to build dozens in the next 20 years. That sounds like it's just an infrastructure challenge. It's not, because when we try to build something, the community says, what are you building that for? Why aren't you doing other things? The reality is we need to build that infrastructure, but we also need to have significant local solar, local storage. And the reality is that electric vehicles will actually help integrate a lot of that renewable energy as well. So it's a excellent question, and the success of the EV industry will rely on us doing our part to make sure that infrastructure is there.
I'll just pile on here and draw an analogy. Everybody wants the low carbon grid, just like everybody wants housing to be affordable. And if we want that low carbon grid, we're going to have to build lots of new stuff. And if we want housing to be affordable, we're going to have to build lots of new stuff. And that's, I think, one of the fundamental political dilemmas that we have in California right now around this whole issue of environmental protection, affordability, and climate change.
Yes, go ahead.
Something important, I was hoping Jason will mention this, is the time of use. Meaning, you know, during the day, you're probably going to drive your electrical vehicle to work, whatever fashion that is going to happen now, and you're going to come back home and charge your car. So now the stress to the grid, or the demand to the grid is changing. It used to be a certain curve, and now the curve is changing. And actually, with the study with NREL, with the National Renewable Lab, that became a huge kind of component on how we got to 100% renewables by 2035. Because also, and now even with the pandemic, because understanding that people maybe are just gonna not commute at all, or are gonna commute in different times. So there's so many variables to answering, you know, your question. And again, I like to come back to the local generation. How are we gonna be able to have local distributed generation in people's neighborhoods, hospitals, homes, supermarkets, churches, so that when people, everywhere they go, they have an opportunity to charge their cars. So it doesn't constrain the grid at a certain time of the day.
Let's see if we can do this quickly. Yes.
Hello, my name is Connor Castillo. First off, I actually had I was like thinking about the same question as Annika. We're in the same class, but anyways, my other question is, you were mentioning that our mayoral candidates currently don't have any sort of environmental issues on their platforms. So whenever we have these elected officials not really standing for these issues that we care about, how do you recommend that students sort of collectively organize and sort of stand up for these issues when even our own elected officials won't?
Now we really are into politics. Go ahead.
I want to make a shout out for traditional media here. The LA Times ran an editorial said, "Where's all the environmental platforms?" And just in the last week, like you saw them, the dominoes fall. So we got 4 of the 5 major candidates put out environmental platforms in by now. So go editorials in traditional media. Beyond that, I do actually, you know, I go to city council meeting, like local city council meetings outside of LA quite a bit. You know, people at that local level actually just like listen to regular folks. We had the city, I'll call out the city of Redondo Beach, recently voted through Clean Power Lines to go to 100% renewable energy. The swing vote, the deciding vote, was persuaded by a 600 student online petition from Redondo Union High School. For that, and you know, 2 of the folks cited that as the reason that they were voting for this. So I think there's a tremendous amount, again, at the very local political level, a tremendous amount of opportunity for, you know, regular folks, students to go out there and make a difference.
Okay, I think go ahead.
Yeah, I was not born, you know, in like politics or anything like that, but I have to say that in 2020, you know, I come from the world of community organizing. I work for the Sierra Club. I have worked with a lot of different organizations locally and nationally. So get involved with your local organization. I came here to USC when I ran for office in 2020, and I see some of the students that supported my campaign. You guys went and door knocked with me, and we talked about my environmental agenda. And it was actually the environmental club here who went every weekend and was out there making phone calls and knocking on doors for me. And that is so extremely important, that we get good people to the city council, to the mayor, to president, to you know, to also carry on this message about energy, renewable energy, equity, accessibility, and also that we make sure that we ourselves are doing everything we can to also empower ourselves and tell our stories and work with other people around these issues to make them relevant.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wind up. I want to thank an absolutely extraordinary group of people on this panel. I tried to ask some provocative and, as I suggested earlier, maybe unpopular questions with some folks, but I think we learned a lot. I also want to thank Joe Arvai and the Wrigley Institute. We've done this now 3 years in a row, and we'll do it again next year. And finally, I have to single out Kami Akavan, our executive director, Erica Maldonado, who did so much work on this, Christy Plaza, who did a great job, Ben, who is our link to Zoom. We didn't have much time to do Zoom questions, and Nicole Pompilio. I mean, a lot of people put a lot of work into this, both at the Center for the Political Future and at the Wrigley Institute. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you next year, if not on Earth Day, in Earth Week or Earth Month. Thanks a lot.